brothers and sisters, I want to welcome you for this evening. And I want to welcome Adrian Ganosono from the Cayuga. He is a keeper of the circle at the Sandy-Saulteaux. And we welcome you, Adrian. And and before we start, I asked Alma if she would say a prayer in Mohawk and also welcoming you in Mohawk here. Okay? Oh.
Living in right relations of Nakonha region. I am thanking the Creator for allowing us to assemble this day and for giving us this day and more days. We are welcoming our brother of the Six Nations, Adrian Jacobs, who will be elaborating a great deal about our background that we'd like to share with you. We thank you for attending. Honor.
Okay, yeah. Over to you, Adrian.
Well, thank you for that welcome. I always like to give everybody a chance to just introduce themselves and say where they're coming from. So if we could just do that in the chat, just let us know where you're coming from. I'm here in Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba. Treaty 1 was in 1871, and it was mostly southern Manitoba, and it goes all the way east to the Winnipeg River. And I live in Lac de Bonnie, which is right on the shore of the, there's a lake there in Lac de Bonnie, but it's the Winnipeg River. And so I'm on the eastern edge of Treaty 1 territory. The Ojibwe people, when they first were meeting together to share in the treaty negotiations, the meeting was held at the lower Fort Garry place. It was a fort that had a stone wall surrounding it. And when the Anishinaabe peoples came together to meet there, they looked at the large stones in the wall, and they said, "That's our grandfathers." And so their memory of this treaty is the Stone Fort Treaty, because one of the things that they tried to remember and pass on to everybody was that creation was witnessing this agreement between the Anishinaabe people and the treaty negotiators from Canada. And part of the reality for us as Haudenosaunee, we recognized that Creator was listening to what we were talking about and was a witness to our agreements. So the word treaty is not just a agreement between nations, like the North American Free Trade Agreement is between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It's a very, important treaty, but it's between the nations. And when President Trump was in charge, he decided to make some changes to it. And he even changed the name of the treaty. So it was no longer, remembered as the North American Free Trade Agreement. He called it something else. But that was the choice of one nation. And then Canada had to respond to that, and Mexico had to respond to that. But in our agreements that we made with one another as Indigenous nations, or with the European nations that came, we acknowledged that the Creator was witness to our agreement. So it was not something that could be easily broken or changed arbitrarily by one nation. That's not how it worked. It was something that was sacred and was something between nations under the Creator. And so the word covenant has been used. Like the word treaty is not our word, and even the word covenant is not our word. And then the word testament is not our word either. But they mean the same thing from their origin in the Hebrew language and then in English translations, etc. The idea of treaty or covenant or testament are similar in meaning. So when we talk about treaties, we're talking about sacred agreements, sacred covenants being made between people. It's kind of like the idea of marriage. It's been recognized that the commitment in marriage is a covenant. They call it the marriage covenant, and it's performed and solemnized by, a minister, a representative of God, and the declaration is made by this individual with this, spiritual authority, and so it's seen as something sacred like that. And so that's the first thing that I wanted to say about treaties, was that they're not just business agreements between people. They're sacred commitments to one another. And so that is different than even the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's called a treaty, a NAFTA treaty, but it's even more sacred than that. And so that's the beginning place. And people often think of treaties as like old-fashioned agreements that happened years ago and nobody remembers them, or it's so old now it's not relevant or whatever. And the reality is, even in Canada's constitution, treaties are the law of the land yet. It doesn't matter when they were made. It matters that they were made and that they have validity. Even here in Manitoba, this is still called Treaty 1 territory because there's treaty obligations on the land. And so it's still acknowledged as Treaty 1 territory. And so the passage of time doesn't change it. In the Old Testament, there was a situation when Joshua was in the land of promise, and he encountered some Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites didn't want to be in warfare with Israel, and so they decided to make a treaty with them. And they pretended to be from a long ways away so that they wouldn't raise suspicion with the Israeli army that was coming to them. And so they wore old clothes and old shoes, and they had moldy bread and etc., just to give the impression that they were from a long ways away. But they made an agreement, and they said that we will be, we don't want to be in warfare with you. We don't want to fight you. We will carry wood and bring you wood, and we'll carry water, and we'll be water carriers. And then after the treaty was made, then they realized that the Gibeonites were locals. They were not from a long ways away. And the people got angry, and they said, they lied to us, and this is not right. And Joshua calmed them all down and said, no, we made a covenant with them. We did it under God. So we can't break the treaty. We can't hurt them because we made a treaty. And then 400 years later, Saul was in the last part of his reign, and he was in trouble with the people. Things weren't going so well. And so, like a lot of leaders in our day today, if it's bad politically, one of the tactics is start a war. So Saul started a war with the Gibeonites, and he killed a lot of Gibeonites. They were not Israeli, so he felt like he could pick on them, and so he killed them. And then nobody really understood what was happening, but there came a famine, not in the time of Saul, but in the time of David, the next king. And it was going on for years. And so whenever there's calamity, David was one to, take the role of a priest and go into the temple and pray and ask the God of Israel, what is wrong? Why is there such a long, prolonged famine? And so when he asked that, God spoke to David and said, it's because Saul killed the Gibeonites. Saul broke the treaty, the 400-year-old treaty, and hurt the Gibeonite people. And God was saying that that's the reason for this calamity on the land. And so there had to be a reckoning. There had to be a way of dealing with that. So I only cite that as the thought that treaties can be 400 years old, but they still matter. They still have consequence. So the treaties that we have are 400 years old as well. And I believe they still have consequence because we made those agreements under the Creator. The Creator's witness to it. And though generations have died, and the original people that made the agreement are not here anymore, those agreements still stand. And so I have here for Haudenosaunee people, we encountered the Dutch in 1613. The Dutch had come up the Albany or the Hudson River, and just about where the Mohawk River meets the Hudson River. The Hudson River is north and south. It goes straight down to New York City. Henry Hudson had come, and in 1609, he had sailed up the river. So they named the river after him, the Hudson River. And so he knew it was there. And in Manhattan Island, in fact, the word Manhattan is from Dutch origin. the New York City, what's called New York City now, was at first called New Amsterdam, because in the 1600s, the Dutch were the world colonizing power. They were going all over the world. They went all the way to Taiwan and colonized Taiwan. So they came to our territory, and they came up the river again in 1613 and encountered our people. They began to build cabins and things like that, and we said, hey, what's going on here? So our people met with them and said, what are you doing here? What's going on? Who are you? And at first, the Dutch wanted a business arrangement. They wanted to do business with our people. They wanted to trade, because in colonization, the Dutch came over and they had things to trade with us. And then they wanted something valuable that they could trade for and then take back to Europe, sell at a high price so that they could pay off their investors and pay off their crews, etc. They wanted an economic agreement with us. Well, when our people responded, we said, well, we're not just after economic agreement with you. We're not just interested in trading. And so we said, we'll make an agreement with you that is between peoples. So this Turo Wampum comes from 1613, over 400 years ago. And actually the white belt represents literally the Hudson River. It's symbolic too, in that it's the river of life. That's the metaphor that we use, river of life. And we said to them, we said, this is our common river of life. We go up and down the same river of life. And we said, this row here that's you coming up and down the Hudson River, this common river of life. In your sailing ship of state, that's you. So in your ship, you have your own pilots. You have your own navigators. You have your own language. You understand each other. You have your own system. You know how it all works. You have your own way of teaching other people. You have leadership, ways of making decisions. That's you in your Dutch ship of state. And we said, this other row, that's us. We're traveling up and down the same river of life, and we are in our canoe of state. We have our own leaders. We have our own language, and we communicate. We give direction, guidance. We educate our own people on how to navigate the river and to do things our way. That's us in our canoe of state. And so the idea really is nation to nation, whether it's like this or like this. There's no domination here. Treaties are not about one group dominating another. In some ways, this is just a giant equal sign. Although that's not what they meant necessarily, but that's what it looks like. And so it's an agreement of equity between nations, between Haudenosaunee people, Mohawk, and then the rest that were, if you go up the Mohawk River, you came to Lake Oneida, to the Oneida people. You go further west, you come to Lake Onondaga and the Onondaga people. You go further west, you come to Cayuga Lake, the Finger Lakes. The Cayuga Lake is the largest Finger Lake, and the Cayuga people. You go a little bit further west, and there's a smaller lake there. I forget what the name is, but it's the Seneca people, near Rochester, and the present day city of Rochester. So that was our Haudenosaunee people. That was one of this row here. That was us. And what we said was, we will have these three rows between us to describe what the values of our relationship are. What is our relationship all about? So the first row was all about the idea of desiring relationship, because we wanted peace and we wanted a relationship. So that's the desire. We were looking for friends, not just trading partners. We were looking for people to have relationship with, strong relationship, not inequitable relationship, but good relationships with. That was the first desire. And in Canada, a lot of the activist community, Indigenous world, they don't like the word reconciliation, because the word reconciliation in many people's mind has become empty, words only. And some have said this, that actually the word reconciliation means to reconcile or to come back together again as friends. And some of our Indigenous activists have said, well, we never became friends in the first place. And there's lots of oppression in our history. But our people, that's what Haudenosaunee wanted. They wanted friends. They wanted a relationship. But we wanted to have it based on respect. So that's that second row. And peace is really all about having respect for somebody else. When you're fully accepted and respected, you can relax. When I came to my mother's house and my dad, every time I came into the living room, I felt completely at peace. I was never afraid that somebody was going to say something to hurt me. I was never afraid that, I would be rejected. I knew that if I came to my house, my parents' house, and if I needed to say something, they would listen to me. In fact, they would listen and they would be quiet, and they would wait to make sure that I said all that I needed to say. And only after that would they then respond to me. So that is the idea of respect that is at the heart of peace. Peace is not the absence of war or conflict. Peace is the place that you are when you are respected. So that's what that second row was all about. And then the third row was, if we make this kind of relationship and we are linked together like this in a good way, in a right way, with a good mind, because this is how a good mind works. When we have that kind of relationship, we will be strong with each other. And so that's what this two-row wampum was all about. The idea that we would have this nation-to-nation relationship. There's nothing in this about selling land. Nobody was agreeing about selling land. We had no concept. We knew this, though, that the land really provided for us in a big way. It fed us. Haudenosaunee people, we grew corn. And during the American Revolution, General Sullivan came through Cayuga territory and burned all of our villages because we were supporting the British. And they came across our caches of corn that were stored, and they burned them too. And they girdled the peach trees so they wouldn't produce into the future. So one of the reasons why we moved up into Canada was our homelands were just destroyed by this army that went up and down Lake Cayuga. But they found later, as they did their kind of, surveying, and the other people came onto our lands, they found that in some places, our villages had 7 years of corn stored and dried. We would never be in famine. We never had a problem with famine because our people knew how to grow and dry and store corn. And even if the hunt was hard in the winter sometimes, we always had corn soup. We always had beans that we could put in, protein, put into our corn soup and get all the nutrients that we needed. So we didn't starve. We weren't people to starve. We knew that the land could provide for us. So we knew that that's what the land does for us. There's plenty of land, and we knew that it would provide for us all. So we weren't selling any land. And anybody who thinks we were has only read the colonized side of history, because that's not what we had in mind. We talked about sharing the land. We talked about, in fact, in 1701, we had, I'll show you a couple of maps here. This is a PowerPoint I did on our land claims in Caledonia. So first of all, what we intended was one thing. That's what I've learned in our history, both the written part from our perspective and also the oral history. We had something in mind. What the colonial system meant it did is another story altogether. I've got books up here that talk about treaties. They talk about, in Canada, there the number of treaties that are listed in this treaty book is over 1,000. Not just the 11 treaties, numbered treaties, but they've got it numbered into the thousands. But that's the colonial system, and they have their own idea of what it meant. So if you read the colonial record of treaties, you don't really know what we had in mind as Indigenous people. It's totally different story altogether. And so what the reality is that we then have to live with something else. We have to live with this misunderstanding. Now, that's the Turo wampum. In 1701, we established a dish with one spoon. So our idea was that the land is a dish. It feeds all of us. And there's one spoon in the middle. This one white part in the middle is the spoon, meaning that the nations around the dish could eat from the land. And this 1701 was made, this wampum agreement was made between Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and English people. And the territory was actually, here is a picture of the territory. Here's Southern Ontario. So up to Tobermory and in the Wendat territory, Toronto, Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, all of Ohio, all of Indiana, and a good part of Illinois, and then the lower part of Michigan. That was actually referred to as the beaver hunting grounds. The beaver was the economic engine of this whole territory back in those days. And the dish was that whole territory. And so we had an agreement with Anishinaabe people and with the English that this land could support us all. We weren't selling it. We were saying, this land can feed us all. And so that's part of the idea of what we had in mind when it came time to making treaty relationships with other people. So when everybody mentions their area where they're from, think of your area that you just mentioned. You know, whether it's a colonial name or whether it's a Haudenosaunee name of whatever territory you're at, think of that territory as a dish. And I say this, that if you have eaten from that land, you are partaking of the benefit of that dish with one spoon relationship. You have entered into treaty benefit. So you're already a recipient of the treaty benefit of the land that you live in. If you pick the apples, or you pick the strawberries, or you eat the corn or the beans or whatever's grown in your part of the world, you are entering into the dish, which is our mother, feeding us. So I'll stop there. I welcome questions or comments from anybody. You can interrupt me at any time. I'm really bad at following the chat, you know, so I can't really see questions there. So I'll rely on Jan or somebody else to, if there are questions that come up in the chat, you can go ahead and put a question there, or just unmute yourself and make a comment or ask a question. I don't want to just go yammering on.
Adrian, I have a question. Reed Sherman here. Oh, sorry. I see Natasha was much more polite than me, putting her hand up. But I'm wondering how quickly did the people realize the difference of meaning between the colonials and themselves? Was it pretty quick, or did it take some decades to figure, oh no, this isn't working?
Well, we've got 1613, and then we have the American Revolution, 1776. So we got a good century and a half plus where we really began to see that the British and the Americans in their conflict, that there was divided powers. The Queen and the American, authorities were differing, and so it became pretty clear that things were not as we had imagined, because the idea was sharing, not fighting with each other. Because even in terms of the English, it was brother against brother, American brother against English brother. And that wasn't our war. That wasn't our fight in that sense. That shouldn't have been something to disturb our situation. One of the things that had been a historical practice for our people was that we said, well, not get involved in the war on either side. You English and you French, when you fight, we're not going to get into that. That's not our fight. That's not our battle. We're staying out of it, because we're in this land, and you kick each other out of the land. We don't do that. We're not moving, so we're not looking to get kicked out of the land. But what happened in the American Revolution was, well, George, like I said, that General Sullivan came and destroyed our villages, and we had nothing to go back to survive. And so all of our people from the Cayuga went to Fort Niagara, which was actually right across the river from Niagara on the Lake, where the Niagara River goes into Lake Ontario, north of Niagara Falls, way north of Buffalo, at the Lake Ontario was Fort Niagara, and we all stayed there because of the devastation, and so we had to rely on other kinds of foodstuffs to make it through the winters. And so Joseph Brant said to the king at the time, "Hey, they've destroyed our place, and Southern Ontario is a part of the dish with one spoon, 1701. So when our people came into Southern Ontario, the Six Nations up the Grand River, that wasn't really a treaty when our lands were set aside. That wasn't a treaty. It was a proclamation. It's called a Haldimand proclamation because Haldimand was the Governor General or the King's representative in Lower or Upper Canada, which Ontario was at that time, Upper Canada. So the proclamation was to the English people, hey, 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, that's for the villages and the exclusive use of the Six Nations people. Mohawks were mentioned primarily, but any of the other Six Nations were welcome. And so we had, up and down the river, we had our villages. So some people would settle, and then other people would move up further. So there's a little town called Cayuga. And the reason it's called Cayuga is because that's where my people settled. That's where our villages were. Further down is Tuscarora, and that's where the Tuscarora people were. Further down was the Oneida territory, and that's where the Oneidas were. Further on was the village of Onondaga, and that's where the Onondagas were. And then there was Brant's Ford, which was Brantford now. That's where the Mohawks were. So we were up and down that river. And it wasn't a treaty in that, we were making an arrangement for it. We were simply saying it was a proclamation by the King's representative that is for our exclusive use. The rest of Southern Ontario is still the Treaty of 1701, shared territory. So, but we soon learned after that's not what the colonized people were after. They were after getting our land. So from 1784, when that land was set aside, the first big loss was 250,000 acres. 1793, Governor Simcoe, who's the next representative of the king, cuts off 250,000 acres. And we realize that the colonized government of Britain and Canada, Upper Canada, is not looking at this the way we are looking at it. So it eventually became pretty clear that it wasn't what we had in mind.
Thank you. Oh boy.
Sure. Is it Natasha?
Yeah, Natasha, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm really amazed by the wampum and the preparation of the beads. And so I have several questions, but I'll start with, were there often many replicas made of the same wampum belt? And would it serve to ensure a common understanding?
We have at Six Nations wampum belt keepers. So we have a very old one that is tattered and falling apart. Just over time, the sinew dries up and the beads break. And also in 1924, Canada came to our council house and stole our wampums and took them to Ottawa. And so I'm sure damage happened in all of that as well. But we got it back, and we have a very old copy of it. But since that time, like this is a replica, and the original wampum belts are made from quahog shell beads, so they're actually tubular beads. And this is blue here. It's more like it's more this color. Now it depends on your computer, but this is purple, and it's more like that. And the quahog shell, if you've ever seen a quahog shell, it's purple and white. And they made the tubular beads from that. And it is a lot of work to make a bead. And so, you know, a big belt, and this would be maybe even wider. The actual belt might be actually wider, but about this long. It took a lot of effort. It was very valuable to have one of these. Now, this is actually made. This is actually made from electrical wire. The coating on electrical wire, it's cut. So that's what the tube is made from, different colors. So the replica is not anything like that original wampum. But I think that's where people got the idea that since wampum was so valuable, that people began to think of it in terms of money. So that idea of wampum being money, or that's a misnomer. That's a colonized person's misunderstanding of what this was all about. And maybe those beads were sold at high price because it takes a lot of work to make a bead like that. So our people have kept copies of this. We would send copies to Britain. Britain would actually Britain sent back their own wampum belts to us, and they had their own meaning incorporated into that. But we have wampum belt keepers. Now, there are a few original belts left. There are some old, because the oldest belt that I know of would be the Hiawatha belt, which is, you know, the purple flag that you see with the peace tree in the middle, and then the four rectangles and joined together in line. That flag is a wampum belt, and the purple is the purple wampum beads, tubular beads. And that goes back to the original founding of the Five Nations Confederacy. And so I don't know that our current copies would be that old because it's over 1,000 years old. But we do have some very old replicas that are falling apart. But, you know, there are there. And there are people like Rick Hill at the Six Nations Polytechnic school at Six Nations. There's an Indigenous knowledge center there, and he has been a teacher, and he's one that can teach on the wampums and share. There are some who can recite the Great Law in all of its 164 some odd what do you call
a clause?
Pardon?
A clause?
Yeah, but I'm searching for our term for that.
Cerol.
Yeah, I guess they call it the 164th wampum. They would call it wampum. And then they would articulate what the law was from that particular wampum. But it takes a long time to recite that. Anything else? Any other question? Or or comment. Alma, you may have stuff to share too. Feel free.
Yes, we have a number of belts that were returned from Albany, the capital of the state of New York. And we had to guarantee that we had a place to put it and someone that'll adequate safes and all that stuff. On a dog, I received some as well. People kept them in their homes that got them from the res, and that's the ones in Albany were kept the longest because they had air conditioning and stuff like that, and the sinews lasted. So we have some back. I don't know where the originals really are. It's not for show. It's for the real feast days. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Any other question or comment from anybody else? I'm here on speaker view, so I don't see everybody. So if I don't see your hand, go ahead and just unmute yourself and speak up.
Well, I've got it on tile right now, so I'm looking. I don't see any hands up, but thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to continue on with some teaching. I have this wampum belt, which is the Haudenosaunee Anishinaabe Peace Belt. And so whenever I talk to people about the two-row wampum, I say, the reason we could say this to the Dutch, that we have these relationships with them, that like the three rows describing the relationship between us and the Dutch, I tell them it's because we had this same kind of relationship with other nations. So our thought was, in the same way that we expect this to be a relationship between the Dutch and us, we have those same expectations of our own peoples, Anishinaabe. So this belt also has the three rows. It's the same three rows. Like our piece is over 1,000 years old. So this idea of, being friends, having peace and respect, and a good mind and strong relationship, that teaching goes way back, and it was between our people, Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. The Haudenosaunee are what is called the Iroquoian language family. And in this language family is Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, Tuscarora, Wendat or Wyandot, they call it in the US, also called Huron by the French, and Cherokee. They're all of the same language family, but they're distinct languages. And it's like the Romance language families of Europe. The Romance languages are Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. Distinct languages, but they come from the same Latin origin. So with our people, we have that same kind of thing. So Haudenosaunee people are of us one language family, but we had relations with the Anishinaabe people, which are of the Algonquin language family. So with the Algonquin language family in Ontario, we have Ojibwe, Chippewa, Mississauga, Anishinaabe, as they would say, Odawa, also Algonquin. But then when you start going to other places, in Quebec, you've got Cree, and there's various versions of Cree. There's a Atikamekw Cree, Eastern Cree, there's Moose Cree, Swampy Cree, Plains Cree, and Mountain Cree. There's probably other Crees as well. There's Y dialect and N dialect. But on the East Coast, you have Mi'kmaq, all the Anishinaabe language family or Algonquin language family. You got Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Abenaki, Passamaquoddy, a bunch of other nations as well. Delaware is a part of that as well. So what we did was we said, we have a relationship, Haudenosaunee people, with the Anishinaabe people, and especially in the dish with one spoon area, that's where you have Chippewa, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Shawnee. They're all that Anishinaabe language family. And so we had that same idea of a path of peace between us based on those same values. And the teaching of this belt is that if either one of the houses puts an obstacle to peace on the path of peace, it's up to that house to remove the obstacle. It's not up to the other house to complain about it. It's not up to the other house to get it off the pathway. It's whoever put the obstacle in the pathway, it's their job to remove it. And that is more about the idea of responsibility. Really, our treaties are about responsibilities, not rights. You know, in the Western world, it's all about rights. But in treaty, it's all about responsibilities. We have responsibilities to one another. We have to maintain those responsibilities with one another. So for me, when I look at this, I can see, you know, other nations, Indigenous nations. But you know what we were also expecting from the Dutch was that that's what kind of relationship they should have with everybody else on their side too. So you Dutch need to be this way with the English and the Spanish and other First Nations. You need to have that same idea. We were convinced that the way of peace was the way to go forward. We still are. We've not changed our mind. I always say this, that our elders gave us the best answer first. You know, in the Western world, everybody's trying to throw away the old agreement and have a brand new one. Go back to the drawing board. They want to, you know, do a new thing again. And I think of my elders, they said, they gave us the best answer first. And you know, even with the conflict in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world, in fact, I brought this belt out at a settler's home near Bethlehem in the West Bank. It's supposed to be Palestinian territory, but they built a Israeli settlement on a hill near Bethlehem. So our group visited there in this Israeli, and he doesn't like the word settler. He's not a settler. He refuses to accept that. He refuses to say that he's in Palestinian territory or he's on the West Bank. He's in Israel. You know, that's his position in it all. So when we went to his home, we had been visiting with Palestinians. We heard all the stories of what was happening with the Palestinian people, just like what happened with us in Canada, with the colonial government. What the Palestinian would tell a story, and I'd tell another story about us in Canada. And our Canadian people in our tour realized that they lived in a colonizing country too. They realized that. And so when we went to this Israeli settler's home, we were waiting to hear his story, but he never told us his story. He just began to question the Canadian. He says, well, what do you think? What you tell me. And as soon as one of the Canadian persons began to say, well, when we were such and such a place in West Bank, Ramallah, or some other place, this is what they said. Immediately, the Israeli settler was arguing. So he says, that's not the way it is. I don't like how you talk. And they were going back and forth. Every time there was an issue raised, there was a back and forth argument. And it kept on going through the whole time that we were there. And I was just listening to this. And then finally, the settler said, well, what is your vision for peace? And I thought, we got to leave shortly. I'm going to jump in here and answer. I didn't have this two-row wampum, but I described it. And I brought it out and I described what I just described to you, how that there is this idea of relationship, sharing this respect and peace and the kind of relationship. So I told the history and I said, that is my vision of peace. And so when we were leaving, you know, the Israeli guy was arguing with all of our team, but he reached out and grabbed my hand in both of his hands. And he said, I like listening to you. And I thought to myself, it's the Indigenous story that came in the middle of an argument and got everybody's attention on something else that could be an actual solution. And to me, I still believe that's the solution. In fact, when the church talks about the kingdom of God and what does that look like? This is what I see. I see the same thing. I see the idea that Jesus was all about this, that his whole ministry and life was to bring people together in relationship. And so I don't see any disparity between my faith in Jesus and my Haudenosaunee understanding of the way of peace. In fact, I told one fella who was not a Christian and he didn't care for the church. I said, you know, and we were commiserating on Caledonia, the fighting and the police and everything going on in Caledonia. And he was shaking his head about how bad it was. And I said to him, I said, you know, the peacemaker said, when things get really bad, that he would come back again. And I said to him, you know, Jesus said the same thing. He said, things could get really bad, but Jesus is coming back. And I said to him, I said, you know, when Jesus comes back, the peacemaker will be with him. And that guy who was anti-Christian just shook his head and he says, you're right. He agreed with me. So to me, that's what I appreciate about our traditional teachings is that that's wisdom from the earth. That's the wisdom of God. In fact, our keeper of the learning circle here at Sandy-Saulteaux, Susie McPherson-Durandy, she's Cree, originally from Churchill. She's lived in Brandon for over 35 years now. But she said this, she said that creation is the first divine revelation. Now, there was actually a Western theologian who said it's the most perfect revelation. It's even more perfect than any of the texts of Scripture. And I thought, okay, I agree with that. So anyways, I find helping people see things from what our people had in mind in the first place helps people understand what it is that we're fighting for. We're not fighting for, trying to take something away from somebody. We're trying to preserve something for everybody because the earth is our mother and provides for us. And the way of destruction that's in the world today, the possibility of nuclear nuclear war and nuclear winter would kill hundreds of millions of people. That is not the way of peace. And to me, these teachings are what has preserved a lot of the biodiversity that's already on the earth. There's something like 80% of the world's biodiversity is in indigenous territories right now. And if you want to know what indigenous people are like, just look at what we do. Do we destroy life or do we preserve life? You just look at the facts, and if 80% of the biodiversity is in the indigenous territory, that's because we're there and we're doing what we can to control it and maintain it, and et cetera. So really, the rest of the world needs to listen to us. Our people have the answers, including the issue of treaty. You know, we're not after kicking people out of their land, but we are all about sharing the resources that are here. So what has happened, like here in Treaty 1 territory, you've got this vast area, but then you've got this tiny little postage stamp size piece of land where only the Peguis people can live. And what happened was, instead of sharing the land, the colonial system forced us from our lands to be stuck on a small piece of land. The land was our refrigerator, so we lost our refrigerator. The land was our sacred place. We lost our church building. The land was our hospital. We lost our hospitals and our medicine. The land was our pharmacy. The land was our recreation. And we got excluded from it. And I don't think there's any indigenous person that says, you know, we need to get rid of all of the white people and send them back to Europe. I'm sure there are some that are really angry that want to say that. But it's the reality is, you know, if we could go back to sharing, in fact, if we could just get back to sharing instead of funneling all the wealth to the top, we'd be all in a better place. Christine, you have your hand up.
Hello, bonsoir. Can you help us understand the fisheries permit conflict in Nova Scotia?
Sure. Last spring, we did a Saturday series, and I spoke to a Mi'kmaq elder, and so we talked about that whole issue and what the Indigenous perspective is. The Mi'kmaq fishery that was under attack had a very tiny percentage of the lobster catch, just a tiny 1 or 2% or something like that, maybe even less than that. And they were up against mega corporations that had 98% of the catch. So if there's any threat to the catch, it's the 98% in what they do. And the whole idea was the lobster fishery was to sustain Mi'kmaq people, not only just to eat themselves, but so that they could trade with others and be able to diversify their economy, because you can't just eat lobster only. You need everything else. So in a mixed economy, you know, you would share the thing that you harvest well. So at one time it was furs. At another time it would have been dried meat. At another time it would have been berries and the dried berries, etc. So the idea was in the Mi'kmaq fisheries, there were no concessions of land or sea in the Mi'kmaq territory. There were no treaties. There were friendship treaties, but that's all about friendship. That's all about this, having a relationship with others that's based on mutual respect. Had nothing to do with land. So there were Mi'kmaq people that said, okay, this land is ours. We can harvest the wood. We need it. We can harvest the sea. And so it led to conflict. And then the court decided, okay, in terms of the fisheries, Mi'kmaq people can have a moderate livelihood from fishing. And the total invention of the court, moderate livelihood, whatever that means. But they were given, that's a part of your right. So the PR battle was this mega fishery that had 98% of all the lobster fishing would say to the Mi'kmaq people, you're ruining the lobster hunting grounds because it's not in season, according to whatever season that they had determined. But it would be a minor influence on the whole thing. And the reality is, our people know how to preserve the life of the animals. Before colonization, the fisheries were fine. Before colonization, the animals were fine. We know how to manage the land. And the real problems is the big commercial fisheries with their drag nets that troll the whole bottom of the ocean, gathering everything up in its wake, destroying habitat and having huge waste because a lot of those things are not marketable, so they get thrown away. So the Mi'kmaq fisheries was a minor thing, but the PR battle had a lot of money behind it. And then there was violence towards our Mi'kmaq brothers. It's just violence that was out of sort. Vandalism and arson, etc. So to me, the story was a PR battle. And the one with a lot of money was able to put across their story and made it sound like Indigenous people are bad. I'll tell you what, every single war works like that. In Russia, in Ukraine right now, it's exactly the same thing. In the Russian territory, you get the Russian version of what's going on. None of the destruction is spoken of or talked officially. And you get people who have that view of what's going on. You see it from the local perception and the local reporting, and you realize that there's another side to the story. It's exactly the same thing that happened in Caledonia. It happened in Oka, the exact same thing. There's a story from one side, and there's the big PR story from the other. And usually the big PR story sways the large part of the population because it's their story that gets told. In fact, Corporal LeMay, who was killed in Oka, his sister is an advocate for Mohawk people. Mm-hmm. She came to Mohawk people and had a time of reconciliation and love, and she received care from the Mohawk community, so much so that she translated into French the story of Mohawk people at Ganosodaage. So when people hear the full story, they have another picture altogether of what's happening. So I'm just saying, just like you can't listen to the colonial record, you kind of have to take the large media with a grain of salt as well, and listen to others that are on the ground. Because like this treaty story, like what I've just told you, is what we've been talking about for hundreds of years. We've been talking this way since 1613. We've never changed our story. In fact, whenever we do have a conflict, we bring this back out and we said, this is what we agreed about in the first place. And we've not changed our mind. So we're keeping covenant. Even if others forget it, and even if others ignore it, we still will keep it. Anybody else or any other question or comment? Christine?
Thank you very much. Thank you. If I may ask, you tell these stories, you smile. I can see on your face that you are relaxed and you sort of smile, but I want to know, how do you feel?
I feel really good because I'm telling the truth. I'm sad about it, and I get very passionate about it. And that's why it comes out strongly, because I know that there's injustice that has happened. But I also know that my ability to be free to be myself, including my laughter and my joy in the middle of all of this, is part of my own health. You can go the way of bitterness and kind of destroy your own life, or you can go the way of hope and say, I believe things can be changed. And even me sharing in this setting is changing minds and helping things for our people. I think that's exactly why Robert said, have Adrian say something, because he can do this for you. Tell you the truth and not hold back from the truth, but also hear it from our perspective, because that's the resilience that is here. That's what's in me, is this. And I can't help but think this is, it's just like a new Christian just met Jesus, and Jesus is going to answer the questions of the whole world. I know that joy too, and I know the joy of this, so it's there in a real way. Natasha?
Hi. What's come to my mind is the whole weight of the legal lawyer system of, so you've mentioned how when growing up, learning about your responsibilities first, learning what your duties are, learning how to contribute is an approach that you put forth is part of your upbringing. And I wonder, how do you see all of this structure of law, and how is there a way to counter it, to discredit it, and to start fresh?
Yeah, I would say that my first comment is whose law? Because I've got great confidence in Haudenosaunee law. And it seems to be that Indigenous law is gaining more and more recognition, even in the court system of Canada. So there's hope for that. Just like the Wet'suwet'en people, they have ancestral law that they've been living by. Nobody ever told them otherwise, and they continue to live by it. The colonial system has done its best to try to colonize them, but they are doing their best to live by Wet'suwet'en law, and that protects the environment. That protects the fish. That protects the bears. That protects the people. And so, that's where my hope is. And my cousin, Beverly Jacobs, is she's at the University of Windsor, and she's head of, I don't know what her exact title is, but it has to do with Indigenous law at the law school at the University of Windsor. And it's people like that I know that they know way more about the law of the colonial system, and they also know Haudenosaunee law, and they're fighting for it. lots of people are fighting for it. The lady that wrote the book, Breathing Life into the Stone Fort Treaty, Amy Kraft, she's got her law degree, and she's fighting for the Anishinaabe law perspective on Treaty 1. So that's happening, and lots of people are doing the same thing right across the country. So that's where my hope is that, I read some things. I don't fully understand it. I do understand that the colonial system is based on a doctrine of discovery, which as a Christian, I've analyzed, and I just say it's foolish. It's a lie. It's hubris. It's kind of, it's not just at all. So my hope really is in our people and the people that are the leaders in various areas. Lisa, I saw your hand up earlier too. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you, Adrian. But you actually answered my question that I had, so thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Okay, Therese, you need to leave. And I can yammer on for a long time, as Robert could probably attest. So if you have to leave, that's fine. I'm okay with that. Any other question? Reed?
Yes, Adrian, you mentioned earlier, I was very intrigued. You mentioned the peacemaker would come with Jesus, and that's such a beautiful image for me. I wonder, is the peacemaker, is that part of the stories of your people? Is there a figure of that?
Yeah.
Quality?
Yeah, our story, it's a national story, international actually, but it is hearkening back to a time when it was not very good for us. There was no peace. We were fighting with each other, nation against nation, clan against clan, family against family, brother against brother. And it was not a good time. And one of the things that I've learned from my elders in their retelling of our own story of the peacemaker is that we have to own all of our history, including the bad parts. Because if you deny something, you'll just reproduce it. You'll just live it out again. And you have to face it, accept it, and deal with it. And so our story is that we were not doing well. We had fallen out of balance. We were not doing good. And there was a peacemaker that was sent to us from another nation. The story goes that it's from Wendat people. And others have other origins, but he came from the north, and he came across Lake Ontario. And we have signs, just like the Bible has signs, people walking on water, bushes that burn that don't consume, mountains of smoke, etc. Our sign was that the peacemaker came across the lake in a stone canoe and came to our people. And he had learned lessons. There's a whole bunch of stories about his upbringing, but he had learned some lessons of peace. And he came to our people, and he knew that we were in bad shape, but he came anyway. And so the first thing was courage. The peacemaker came to face our people. And he landed in our territory closest to the Onondagas, and there was somebody there that was really, really a bad person. Arataro was his name. He was so bad that the story goes that he could kill you by looking at you. There was the story that I was told was that there was a man in that nation that had beautiful daughters, and one by one they began to die, until finally they all died. All of his daughters died. And then his wife died. And the suspect was this great evil leader that lived in the swamps, Haudenosaunee. The story was that, he had this evil eye that he could do bad medicine and do damage to people and hurt them. And during a time of warfare, everybody protects themselves. They protect their heart. They don't open up. You don't cry. You do what you can to stay out of sight from anybody. So nobody would comfort him. And he was so forlorn. He had lost his whole family. And the story is that he wandered into the bush and he just sat down in the bush just for days and days. I don't know how long he was there. So taken in grief, kind of like Job. I think about what happened with Job.
Mhm.
Job had a lot of calamity, but the biggest calamity was the loss of his children. And so he sat in dust and ashes, and he never said a word. He just scratched himself. He had boils, and it was really bad. And he just sat in dust and ashes. And then his friends came, and they sat down with him. And as long as they kept their mouth shut, they were doing good. As soon as they opened their mouth, then they were not good. They became his tormentors instead of his comforters. So I can imagine the grief of this man. His name was Hiawatha, and he was so taken with grief. But one day he came to himself, and he had strung together some wampum beads, and he said, the story is that he stuck two sticks in the ground and a stick across, and he took wampum, and he said, if I ever come across someone who has lost a loved one and they're so full of grief and they're just weeping and their tears are flowing down their face and obscuring their vision and they can't even see, he said, with this wampum, I will wipe away their tears so that they can see again. He said, if I come to somebody who is so taken in grief that they can't even hear you, sometimes when somebody is in the shock of funerals and death, you can talk to them and it's like they're not even there. They don't even hear you. They don't even remember you talking to them. Said, if I come across somebody like that with this wampum, I will clear out their ears so that they can hear the words of comfort that I have for them, to let them know that I am with them and I will comfort them with this string of wampum. And then the third wampum, he says, if I come across somebody who has lost their loved one and it's so choking them up that they can't even speak, with this wampum, I will clear the choking away out of their throat, and then they can speak again and speak of their loved one and how that they've lost them. And so that is the beginning of the condolence ceremony. Actually, I think there are 13 wampum that are a part of that full ceremony. But it was such an impactful thing. And again, this is the story that I heard. He had come from the Onondaga, but he eventually made his way over to Mohawks and, became a leader among the Mohawks. And so he had this condolence ceremony that was really impactful for the people, especially in a time of war and death and loss. To be able to have a condolence where people are comforted was so impactful, and he was a leader. So the peacemaker bypassed the Onondagas and went past the Oneidas and came to the Mohawks and began to talk to them about this message of peace that he was going to bring. And he said that on this journey, he said the Mohawks that came to him really didn't believe him, not at first. And they just, so he could tell they were doubting. And he said, I'll climb up this tree And I've been through the Mohawk Valley, the upper reaches, and there's this cliff area. And he says, I'll climb up this tree. You chop it down and it'll fall into the gorge to the Mohawk River Valley. And if I live, my message is true. So they did that. He fell over the side. Next day, he came to them. And so they began to listen to him. And so Hiawatha and the peacemaker joined together. But there was also another woman that the peacemaker met earlier among what are known as the neutral people. But this woman, during this time of warfare with people fighting back and forth, nation against nation, family against family, brother against brother, she had a reputation that if you were tired and hungry and needed rest, she would welcome you into her longhouse. She would, if you're hungry, she would give you a hot meal. If you were tired, she would give you a place to sleep. If you were just worn out from whatever your journey, you would have a place of respite. And she said to even competing warriors, but you cannot bring your weapons of warfare inside. You must leave them outside. And so somehow the peacemaker had come along, had heard of this woman, and came to the longhouse and saw all the weapons there, goes inside of the longhouse, and here are competing warriors who normally would be fighting and killing one another, eating together. No bad words, no arguments. They were at peace. It so inspired the peacemaker that he convinced this woman, her name was Jugonsasa, to join with him and make a longhouse of peace of nations, not just her individual longhouse, but a whole nation with Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Senecas in a longhouse of peace, with Mohawks as eastern doorkeepers, Senecas at western doorkeepers, and this longhouse of peace. And said to Jugonsasa, you will choose the chiefs. You know human nature. You know who would make the best peace chiefs and ones that would promote peace. And so the idea came that that's how things would be done, that the women, the clan mothers, would choose the chiefs. And so he had convinced all the Mohawks to join. He convinced all of the Oneidas to join. He passed by the Onondagas because they weren't ready yet. He came to the Cayugas. And when he came to the Cayugas said, after they heard his message, come back tomorrow. And what our people meant was, come back next year. We're going to talk about this. We're going to discuss this proposal of peace. And we'll let you know 1 year from now. So the peacemaker came back and said, we're in. So our people joined. And then it came to the Senecas. He was only able to convince half of the Senecas at first. And so there came a time they passed by the Onondagas because Aotearoa wasn't ready. And he announced to everybody, we need to go to the Onondagas now. So all the Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, and half of the Senecas joined together, and they approached Onondaga. And Aotearoa was their main chief, and he thought everybody was going to come to kill him. So he was ready for war. And so he's prepared. His soldiers are there ready to fight. And all of the nations are there. And the peacemaker came forward. Where's I don't have my rattle. I don't know where my rattle is. But I had a rattle. And he sang the peace hymn. It's kind of like that story where Israel was fighting and the people with the trumpets came up. They didn't even have to fight. But this story is even better because nobody dies. The peacemaker is singing this song of peace. And then the clan, this is how the story was told to me. The clan mothers came forward and they went right up to Aotearoa. So his soldiers stood down, his warriors stood down. They knew something was going on special. And it says that they combed. The image of Aotearoa was that he was a wild man who lived in the swamps, who was a cannibal, who was a wizard, who was not a good person, who his picture is that his head was full of snakes, wild tangle of hair. But the clan mothers came and they combed the snakes out of his hair. And the story is that his visage was changed and he became like a normal man. And so he accepted the peace that the peacemaker had brought. So our story is when all of the nations got together and they ratified this, it says that the peacemaker uprooted the tree of the great long leaves. And the interpretation of that is the white pine tree. If you ever see the canopy in New York State, you know, there's a certain level of the deciduous forest, but then standing tall in the midst of that are the white pine trees. So this white pine tree became the symbol of peace, where the peacemaker said he uprooted it, and there was a great hole and a river at the bottom, and all the nations threw in their weapons of war, and the river took those weapons away, and he planted that tree of peace. So on that Hiawatha belt, that flag, the peace tree is in the middle, and that's the Onondaga Nation. They became the chair nation. Aotearoa became the one who called the nations together. He was given an eagle fan from the peacemaker, and his job was to guard the fire and keep all things that would disturb the peace away from that fire, and that he would call the nations together. And then next to the tree are two large rectangles, and they're the two smaller nations, Oneida and Cayuga. But they are larger than the Mohawk or the Seneca because when somebody came into the longhouse that was from the east of another nation, they sat under and with the Oneidas on the east. They came in from the west, they sat under and with the Cayugas. And so their house had to be big to be the host for all of those people. And then the Mohawks, eastern doorkeepers, the Senecas, the western doorkeepers. And so that is the story of our people. When I say peacemaker, that's that story that I'm referring to. And it's quite similar to the idea of Melchizedek in the Old Testament, in Genesis 14. You have Melchizedek, who is a picture of Christ. I don't believe he was Christ. I don't believe it was an incarnation of Christ. He was Canaanite, but he was a king and a priest, like Christ would be. And he served bread and wine, which is like communion. And he blessed Abram. So he was a blesser. So very much like a picture of Christ and who Christ is to all of us. And so in that same way, I would say when Jesus, the peacemaker, comes back, our peacemaker comes back, I say the same thing. Melchizedek will be with him. You know. So to me, that's the story that I'm understanding about the peacemaker. Lisa, your hand is up.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Knowing more about the treaties, what is the best way to uphold them? An elder once taught me, once you know, you can't unknow. So that knowing is part of all of our story that we've been here tonight.
Yeah. My first advice is bring it to your table. Tell your family. When you eat with people, tell them what you learned. Go ahead and study and listen to other people, learn more, and bring it to your table. Because it's at the table that transformation happens. When there was a big conflict in Caledonia, we called the Mennonites down to our church at Six Nations, and the Mennonite people fell in love with my dad, who's not a speaker, who's not a preacher, but he lived in Caledonia and he embodied peace. So they said, please come and tell us your story. And so at 79 years old, I took my father for his first public speaking engagement of his life.
Amazing.
And transformation happens at the table. If it doesn't begin there, it's just a subject for university, I guess.
I will bring it to the table. Nyawa. Nyawa, Adrian, I appreciate that.
Yeah. Anybody else or any other question or comment or challenge? I can take some challenges too. Sure, Jacqueline.
It's more of a comment than a question, but maybe there's a question at the end. But I read a wonderful book recently called The Gatherings, which is about Indigenous and settler relations. And it was about Nova Scotia and south of Nova Scotia into the United States, and groups of Indigenous people and settlers who would come together in these gatherings. I think it was twice a year, and sit in circles and share. And I just thought that was, for me, that was just one of the most wonderful, like, I was jealous when I was reading about it, because I thought I would love to be able to do that. I have done that once. I was part of a white buffalo ceremony here with the chief, Dominique Rankin. And that was an amazing experience. And that was the first time I'd been, invited into the circle of a ceremony that was so sacred. And then we got to see the white buffalo that had been born, which was really something. Mm-hmm. And I was really touched by that experience. And I guess my question would be, is there anything, are there any opportunities like that where, I could be present and I could hear stories and share, because that's how I feel I would learn.
Yeah. Here at Sandy-Saulteaux, the Broken Head River goes around our property. We have 36 acres, and it's the Broken Head River. And if you take it all the way to the north to Lake Winnipeg, you come to the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation. And we have had, last fall, something called Circles of Reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And the idea here is that there would be 10 Indigenous people, and they were all from Broken Head, and then 10 non-Indigenous people meet in circle. And then it's just a very casual, let's just listen to one another's story. And 10 weeks, there is a program. It kind of guides you through doing that together. So something like that could be done, where people are sitting together. That's a formal thing, and that's helpful. When it can translate into real casual, like friendship, living room kinds of smaller conversations, that's even more transformative. The more personal it gets, the more transformative it becomes. Right. So I think that there are different things like that can be done. I always tell people that, at Six Nations, there's over 20 churches.
Wow.
There's about 13,000 people that live there. And people said, oh, you got lots of churches. I looked in the phone book at Winkler, Manitoba, same size as Six Nations. They had about 13 or 15 churches there. So we're not too far out of like the normal for having different kinds of churches. There's so many nations there, but any one of them are open doors to visit. So there are places to go to. And some people ask me, can I go to your church? and I would say to them, I never asked to come to yours. So that's one place. Another thing is there are lots of public events. At Six Nations, we have probably the largest powwow in Canada, the Grand River Champion of Champions. Last weekend in July of every year, 15,000, 20,000 people come together for that. So you can get to know somebody in that situation. So there are all kinds of public events, especially if a community is a community newspaper. They often have websites, so they would have like community events that would be happening as well. So getting to know somebody and then letting that become real organic, letting it grow, and you'll find after a while, just like with your other friendships, they, some pan out, some don't, but you'll find your way in it. And I think that, like, I can list off to you all of my colonial friends. I can list them all. I can tell you all of my Indigenous friends of other nations. And I'm not anything special. In fact, I'm an introvert. But I have tons of friends. And if I can do it, you can do it too.
Okay. You've convinced me. No, that's a lot of good advice and ideas. I appreciate that. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Sure. Robert or Alma?
Yeah,
Either one?
Adrian, last week we during our meeting of the Living Right Relations, our group, we sat and we dreamt. We spent a learning circle about dreaming about what our church should be like, our relationships. And I felt that a lot of people felt good about it. People felt good, I think. And maybe you can hear others speak to that. But I think it was great. And I hope to see more of that. And like Lisa, I think we're planning to do it again. And that's why it's so nice for you to come tonight, and maybe you could just tell them like what we do in our learning circles at class at the Sandy-Saulteaux.
Mhm.
We've had a lot of them. People share, and we get a lot of stuff done.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I'm trying to take Alma to show what it's all about.
Yeah. Yep, I'm looking forward to Alma being in our circle here. I'm sure that you'll enjoy it.
Blow your socks off. Yeah. Well, every bit of it was interesting, Adrian. Very nice. And I have no corrections to make. I'm happy. I'm happy with everything you said and more. And getting the belts back, we had masks that were in the museums in Ottawa, Museum of Man. And they started asking us if we would take care of them, get them out of there because they were having difficulties.
Mhm.
And I sent some people there to get it. And there was a proper way to do it. We got the elders to go. And not so aware of them. I had never seen them. As a matter of fact, they were all captured and held somewhere. and they were letting that go. The elders together said, because we're ready. And I feel the same way about discovering these graves, that we are ready to take care of it.
Right.
So it's a comparison, and we took care of all that stuff. Albany and New York also had lots of bones there.
Mhm.
They were in a pile. We brought those back, and that was a major operation, and those children are going to return home,
Mhm.
and it's time.
Yeah.
Honor.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's, I really appreciate that, Alma. I have lots of Mohawk mothers who have who have not only encouraged me, but let me know where I need to get in shape up too. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
And one of the things that I wanted to really share with you as well is the idea that our languages are so important to the worldview. Somebody described the English language as noun-based. And when they were describing this, and I've heard several now mention that, nouns are distinct, like there's clarification of what something is, and it's very specific. And there's a real thinking process that goes into making nouns. I talked to another man who was Maori from New Zealand, and so I mentioned this about the language, and he says Maori is verb-based. He says it begins with the action, and then you modify everything from there. He says it's a very active, moving kind of language. And then I've noted that with our Haudenosaunee world, it's a very picturesque language, very, very much full of metaphor, beautiful expressions of, you can see it. Like when people say certain words and explain what it is, it's like, yes, I can see that. I see that. It's visual that way. And one thing that colonial people noted about Haudenosaunee people was this ability to be an orator, to express things in a very picturesque, verbally painted way. And so I think that that's part of the genius that is behind all of our nations. Each of us have different things to contribute from our languages. They come from our lands, and our elders took a long time to put the lessons together from our lands into our cultures. And you know, when people fight in an either or kind of way, either you're with us or against us, or you know, you're us or them, that kind of approach, you just end up hurting. But when you can look at each other and say, we both are valuable and we can do things together, and look at the things that we bring together to the bigger picture and honor that's where community building can happen between nations, within nations, sure, but also between nations. And I think that that's what the world's struggling with right now, trying to figure out how can we not lord it over each other and make each other our slave, but how can we live together, honoring one another and saying, Everybody has something good to contribute. Everybody has something to give that's important and valuable, and we don't need to compare it with somebody else's. We just need to receive it from one another. And, you know, when the vision of Canada comes, people ask me, what's that vision? It's the two-row wampum. And some people look at this as, you know, dividing. No, this is uniting. This is bringing people together in a respectful relationship where I don't lord it over you and you don't lord it over me, but we honor whatever it is that each has to bring to the other. So even within churches, it's the same idea that, you know, some churches have different gifts. Different people come to the church and it's got a different character. That's okay, because that's who they are. And we are something else. And we are just as valuable, and we have our own contribution. And when we dismiss each other in any way, or belittle each other, or put each other down, or become blind to one another, that's when trouble comes in. We are putting an obstacle in the path of peace. And it's up to us to go out and remove that obstacle. And that means facing our own responsibilities and say, well, I am sorry. I shouldn't have said that. We shouldn't have acted that way. I apologize. You know, that's the language of peace, not I'm perfect and, you know, I know everything. We've had enough of that.
Well, that's good.
Janle.
Then I can see you. Aye.
Something really hawk,
Yeah.
Stian.
Yeah.
Well, Adrian sure would like to thank you. I agree with every word you said. You put it very nicely, very, very nicely. I'm very pleased. It's the one who allowed the square this. A quick was cut with or get the roll get gone down. A quick would we no near soon away. Let us thank the Creator for allowing us this evening. Let us thank the Creator for allowing us to hear what the gentleman has said. Let us thank the Creator for protecting our people, our families, when you get home, that they are safe. That is the key. It's all Thanksgiving. We thank Creator for everything that we heard tonight. Yamo, thank you.
Yo, go,
Yeah.
Adrian.
No, go.
Yeah.
Yeah, go.
Thank you so
Merci
much.
beaucoup. Merci.
Yeah.
And blessings on the next step of your journey, Adrian.
Sure. Yeah, looking forward. Again, thank you for your big ears.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring us all together.
Yeah, we'll
here.
see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Don't
Bye now.
let your light go out, Adrian. You have a light that shines. Please never let it dim. Thank you.
Nice. Yeah.